It was a bright, sunny afternoon in Maple Grove. This was a small, quiet neighborhood where kids played outside, dogs barked happily, and nothing crazy ever seemed to happen. Or at least, that's what everyone thought. Maple Grove was the kind of place where people waved hello, mowed their lawns, and kept things nice and calm. But something big was about to shake things up, and no one saw it coming. Let me tell you about Linda Harper. She lived in a neat little house with a perfect green yard. Linda was the kind of person who liked everything just right. She walked around the neighborhood with a clipboard in her hand, like she was the boss of everyone. People called her HOA Karen when she wasn't listening. HOA stands for Homeowners Association. It's a group that makes rules for the neighborhood. Linda loved those rules more than anything. If someone's trash can was out too long, she'd knock on their door and yell. If a lawn wasn't cut short enough, she'd leave a mean note. She acted like she was the queen of Maple Grove, and most people just stayed out of her way. When you saw Linda coming, you knew trouble was close behind. She had sharp eyes that spotted every little mistake. One time, she told Mr. Jenkins his mailbox was the wrong color. Another time, she yelled at little Sammy because his bike was on the sidewalk. People didn't like her much. They'd roll their eyes and whisper, "Oh no, here comes HOA Karen again." But they didn't argue with her. It was easier to just nod and move on. Nobody knew it yet, but Linda was about to do something so wild, it would change how everyone saw her. Now, let's meet Jake Miller. Jake was brand new in town. He was young, maybe 25 years old, with a big smile and a kind heart. Jake wasn't like Linda at all. He didn't care about rules or perfect lawns. He cared about helping people. Jake was a paramedic. That's a person who rides in an ambulance and saves lives when someone's hurt or sick. He wore a blue uniform and drove a big red ambulance with flashing lights and a loud siren. To Jake, that ambulance was like a superhero car. Every day, he rushed around town, ready to help anyone who needed him. Jake loved his job. When the phone rang at the ambulance station, he'd jump up fast. "Time to go," he'd say, and off he'd speed to save the day. One time, he helped a lady who fell down her stairs. Another time, he took care of a kid who crashed his skateboard. People in Maple Grove didn't know Jake yet, but they were about to. He was quiet and nice, not loud like Linda. He didn't boss anyone around. He just did his job and made people feel safe. Kids waved at his ambulance when it drove by, and grown UPS smiled because they knew he was there to help. In Maple Grove, things stayed the same day after day. The sun came up, the birds sang, and Linda bossed everyone around. Jake was new, so nobody thought much about him yet. They didn't know he was going to turn everything upside down. Linda didn't know it either. She thought she was in charge, like always. She had no idea she was about to pick a fight she couldn't win. And Jake? He had no clue he'd soon meet the bossiest lady in town. Two very different people were about to crash into each other, and it was going to be a big, crazy mess. Picture this, Linda walking down the street with her clipboard, looking for something to complain about. She wore big sunglasses and a frown that never went away. Her hair was always perfect, and her shoes clicked loud on the sidewalk. She'd stop and stare at every house, making sure nobody broke her rules. If a dog barked too much, she'd write it down. If a car parked a little crooked, she'd shake her head. Linda thought she kept Maple Grove perfect. But really, she just made people tired of her. Then picture Jake, driving his ambulance with the windows down. He'd hum a little song while he waited for the next call. His uniform had his name on it, Jake Miller, paramedic, and he kept his medical bag right next to him. That bag was full of stuff to help people, bandages, a stethoscope, even a little machine to check someone's heart. Jake didn't care about trash cans or lawns. He cared about making sure everyone was okay. If he saw someone wave, he'd wave back with a big grin. He was the opposite of Linda in every way. Nobody in Maple Grove thought these two would ever meet. Why would they? Linda stayed busy yelling at neighbors, and Jake stayed busy saving lives. They lived in the same neighborhood, but it was like they were in different worlds. Linda's world was all about control. Jake's world was all about helping. What happens when a control freak like Linda runs into a hero like Jake? Can you guess? It's not going to be boring, that's for sure. Here's a little question for you: have you ever met someone who thinks they're the boss of everything? Maybe at school, or in your neighborhood. Linda was that person times 10. She didn't just boss people, she ruled like a queen with a crown made of rules. And Jake? He was the new kid who didn't follow anyone's orders unless it was to save a life. These two were like oil and water, they didn't mix. But on this sunny day in Maple Grove, their paths were about to cross in the wildest way possible. Imagine the neighborhood that afternoon. Kids rode bikes, birds chirped, and the sun shone bright. Everything seemed normal. Linda was probably checking her list of rules, ready to find someone to scold. Jake was at the station, polishing his ambulance, waiting for a call. It was just another day until it wasn't. Something big was coming. Something that would make everyone in Maple Grove talk for weeks. Linda thought she knew everything, but she didn't know Jake. And Jake had no idea he was about to meet the toughest challenge of his day. So, what do you think happens next? When a lady who loves power meets a guy who saves lives, it's got to be a story worth hearing. Stick around, because this is just the beginning. Linda's about to make a move so crazy, you won't believe it. And Jake? He's about to show what a real hero looks like. Get ready, it's going to be a bumpy ride. It was a busy Tuesday in Maple Grove, and the day was about to get a whole lot wilder. Jake Miller, the new paramedic, was sitting in his ambulance station when his phone rang. He picked it up fast, like he always did. "Hello, this is Jake," he said. The voice on the other end sounded scared. "Help. My grandpa's having a heart attack," it shouted. Jake didn't waste a second. He jumped into his big red ambulance, turned on the flashing lights, and hit the siren. Woo woo woo. Off he went, speeding down the streets of Maple Grove. Every minute mattered when someone's heart stopped working right. Jake knew he had to get there quick. Maple Grove wasn't far, so Jake zoomed in with his lights flashing bright. The siren was loud, telling everyone to move out of the way. He turned onto the street where the emergency was, a little house with a blue door. Jake's eyes were sharp, looking for the perfect spot to park his ambulance. He needed to be close to the house so he could run inside fast. But then he saw something that made him frown. Right where he wanted to park was a shiny silver SUV. It was Linda Harper's car, and it was taking up the best spot. Jake didn't have time to think too hard. Someone's life was on the line. He looked around quick and saw another spot nearby. It wasn't as close, but it would do. He pulled his big ambulance into that space and turned off the engine. The spot had a sign that said reserved for Linda Harper. Yep, it was Linda's special parking place, the one she loved more than anything. She'd fought hard to get that spot just for herself. But Jake didn't know that. All he knew was he had to save someone, and he wasn't going to let a parking spot stop him. Just as Jake grabbed his medical bag and opened the ambulance door, a loud voice boomed across the street. "Hey! You can't park there," it yelled. Jake turned his head a little and saw Linda Harper storming out of her house. She moved fast, like a tornado, spinning toward him. Her arms were waving in the air, and her face was already turning pink with anger. Linda's house was right next to the emergency, so she'd heard the siren and seen the ambulance pull in. And oh boy, she was mad. That parking spot was hers, and nobody, not even an ambulance, was allowed to touch it. Jake stepped out of the ambulance, his blue uniform neat and his medical bag in his hand. He didn't have time to argue. "Ma'am, this is an emergency," he said. His voice was calm but strong, like he meant business. He didn't even look at Linda for long, just a quick glance, because he had to get to that blue door house fast. Someone inside was in big trouble, and Jake was the only one who could help. He started walking toward the house, his shoes tapping on the pavement. But Linda wasn't done. Not even close. She stomped closer, her shoes clicking loud on the ground. "I don't care," she shouted. "That's my spot." Her face was bright red now, like a tomato ready to burst. She pointed at the ambulance like it had done something mean to her. To Linda, that parking spot wasn't just a place to park, it was her prize. She'd told everyone in the neighborhood it belonged to her, and she'd even put up that sign herself. Seeing Jake's big red ambulance sitting there made her so mad she could hardly think straight. Jake kept moving, not stopping for Linda's yelling. He had a job to do, and he wasn't going to let her slow him down. But Linda's voice got louder. "Move that thing right now," she screamed. She waved her arms even more, like she was trying to scare the ambulance away. Neighbors started peeking out their windows. Some opened their curtains just a little, watching the show. "What's Linda yelling about now?" one whispered. "She's fighting an ambulance," another said, shaking their head. Everyone knew Linda loved to boss people around, but this was new. Linda stood there, hands on her hips, glaring at the ambulance like it was her worst enemy. To her, it wasn't just a vehicle, it was a big, red bully stealing her special spot. She didn't care that Jake was trying to save someone. She didn't care about the flashing lights or the loud siren. All she could see was her parking space, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it. Little did she know, this fight was just starting, and it was going to get a lot bigger than she ever imagined. Jake didn't turn back. He walked faster toward the house, his mind on the grandpa who needed him. He could hear Linda shouting behind him, but he blocked it out. "I'll deal with her later," he thought. Right now, every second was precious. He didn't know the man inside that house, but he knew he had to help. That's what paramedics do, they run toward trouble, not away from it. Linda's yelling faded a little as he got closer to the door, but he could still feel her eyes burning into his back. Meanwhile, Linda wasn't calming down. She pulled her phone out of her pocket and started tapping the screen. Her fingers moved fast, like she was on a mission. She wasn't just going to yell, she was going to do something about this. "Nobody parks in my spot and gets away with it," she muttered to herself. Her face was so red it looked like it might pop. She didn't care that Jake was a paramedic or that his ambulance had lights and sirens. To her, rules were rules, and she was the queen of rules. The neighbors kept watching. A little girl named Mia stood by her window, holding her teddy bear. "Why's Linda so mad?" she asked her mom. Her mom sighed. "Because she thinks that parking spot is more important than anything," she said. Mia tilted her head. "But isn't the ambulance helping someone?" Her mom nodded. "Yes, sweetie, but Linda doesn't see it that way." Across the street, old Mr. Jenkins leaned on his cane and watched. "That lady's lost her mind," he mumbled. Everyone could see this was silly, but Linda couldn't. The air in Maple Grove felt tight, like something big was building up. Jake was focused on his job, racing to save a life. Linda was focused on her parking spot, ready to fight anyone who touched it. Two people, two totally different ideas, crashing together on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. It was loud, it was messy, and it was only the start. Linda thought she was in control, but she didn't know what was coming. Jake thought he could just do his job, but he didn't know Linda yet. This was the moment everything started to change. So, what do you think happens when someone like Linda won't back down? And what happens when someone like Jake won't stop helping? This fight was small right now, but it was about to grow into something huge. Linda's red face and loud voice were just the beginning. Stick around, because this story's getting wilder by the minute. Jake didn't have time to listen to Linda's yelling. He had a job to do, and it was a big one. He ran fast toward the little house with the blue door, his medical bag bouncing against his side. Inside was Mr. Thompson, a sweet old man who lived alone. Mr. Thompson was kind to everyone. He'd wave at kids, give cookies to the mailman, and always smile. But right now, he wasn't smiling. He was lying on the floor, holding his chest, barely breathing. His heart was in trouble, and Jake knew he had to act quick. Jake pushed open the door and dropped to his knees next to Mr. Thompson. "Hang on, sir, I'm here to help," he said softly. The old man's eyes were scared, but he nodded a little. Jake opened his bag and pulled out his tools. He put a mask on Mr. Thompson's face to help him breathe better. Then he checked his heart with a little machine that beeped loud. Beep beep beep. It wasn't good, but Jake stayed calm. He worked fast, giving medicine and talking to Mr. Thompson to keep him awake. "You're doing great," Jake said. "Just stay with me." Outside, Linda wasn't calming down. She didn't care that Jake was saving a life. All she cared about was her parking spot. She stood on the sidewalk, glaring at the big red ambulance like it was a monster. Her arms waved, her voice shouted, but Jake didn't hear her anymore. Linda huffed and puffed, then pulled her phone out of her pocket. She tapped the screen with angry fingers and held it to her ear. She was calling 911, the emergency number. Can you believe it? She was calling the cops on an ambulance. 911, what's your emergency? The voice on the phone asked. Linda didn't even take a breath. "There's a vehicle stealing my parking spot," she yelled loud enough for the whole street to hear. The person on the phone, a dispatcher who helps send police or ambulances, sounded confused. "Ma'am, is it an emergency vehicle?" they asked. Linda's face scrunched up like she'd eaten a sour lemon. "I don't care what it is," she snapped. "It's in my spot." She crossed her arms and smirked, like she'd just won a big game. She thought the cops would come running to help her. Back inside the house, Jake didn't know what Linda was doing. He was too busy. Mr. Thompson's breathing was getting better slowly, but it was working. Jake wiped sweat off his forehead and smiled a little. "You're tough, Mr. Thompson," he said. The old man's eyes flickered, and he squeezed Jake's hand weakly. Jake grabbed a stretcher from the ambulance and slid it inside. With careful hands, he lifted Mr. Thompson onto it and rolled him out the door. Every step was fast but steady. He had to get him to the hospital quick. As Jake pushed the stretcher toward the ambulance, the neighbors started watching closer. Windows cracked open, and heads poked out. Little Mia, the girl with the teddy bear, pressed her nose to the glass. "Is Mr. Thompson okay?" she whispered to her mom. Her mom nodded. "Jake's helping him," she said. But then they heard Linda's voice, still yelling into her phone. Mia's eyes got big. "Is she serious?" she asked. Her mom sighed. "I think she is, sweetie." Across the street, Mr. Jenkins leaned on his cane and watched. He shook his head slow. "She's lost it," he muttered. Another neighbor, Mrs. Carter, peeked through her curtains. "Calling the cops on an ambulance. That's crazy," she said to herself. Everyone could see Jake working hard, his blue uniform moving fast as he loaded Mr. Thompson into the ambulance. And everyone could see Linda standing there, arms crossed, looking proud. It didn't make sense. Why was she so mad about a parking spot when someone's life was at stake? Linda hung up the phone and tapped her foot, waiting. She thought the police would show up any second and make Jake move the ambulance. She didn't know what was really happening inside that house. She didn't know Mr. Thompson was fighting to stay alive. To her, it was all about her spot, her special, reserved parking space with her name on it. She'd told everyone in Maple Grove it was hers, and she wasn't going to let some loud ambulance take it away. She smirked again, like she'd already won. But something big was sneaking up on her, and she didn't even notice. Jake closed the ambulance doors after Mr. Thompson was safe inside. He climbed into the driver's seat and took a deep breath. His hands were steady, but his heart was racing. He'd done it. Mr. Thompson was breathing again, and now they just had to get to the hospital. He didn't look at Linda. He didn't hear the neighbors whispering. He just turned the key, ready to go. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Linda's yelling had been loud, and trouble was brewing. The neighbors kept talking. "She can't really think the cops will help her, right?" Mrs. Carter said to her husband. He shrugged. "It's Linda. She thinks she's the boss of everything." Little Mia hugged her teddy bear tighter. "I hope Mr. Thompson's okay," she said. Her mom patted her head. "He will be, thanks to Jake." But then they all looked at Linda, standing there with her smirk. It was like she was in her own world, where parking spots mattered more than people. Linda didn't see the neighbors staring. She didn't care what they thought. She was sure she was right. That spot was hers, and nobody could take it, not even a paramedic with flashing lights. She tapped her foot faster, waiting for the police to come. In her mind, she'd tell them her story, and they'd make Jake move. She didn't think about what Jake was doing or why his ambulance was there. She just wanted her way, like always. But here's the thing, something big was coming. Linda thought she was winning, but she didn't know the whole story yet. Jake wasn't just some guy in an ambulance. He was a hero, and heroes don't give up easy. The neighbors could feel it too. The air in Maple Grove was getting thick, like a storm was about to hit. Linda's phone call was a spark, and it was going to light up something huge. She stood there, smirking, but she had no idea what was rolling her way. Jake started the ambulance engine. Vroom. It rumbled loud, ready to race to the hospital. He didn't look back at Linda. He didn't need to. His job was to save Mr. Thompson, and that's what he was doing. But Linda's fight wasn't over. She thought she'd won a little battle by calling 911, but she didn't see the bigger war coming. The neighbors whispered more, their voices mixing with the sound of the ambulance. Something was building, and it was going to be wild. What do you think happens when someone like Linda keeps pushing? She didn't stop, even when Jake was helping someone. She didn't care about anything but her spot. But Jake wasn't stopping either. He was saving a life, and that's bigger than any parking space. This moment was just the start. Things were about to get crazier, and Linda was in for a big surprise. Keep listening, because you won't believe what's next. The sun was still shining bright in Maple Grove, but things were about to get loud and crazy. Jake had just finished loading Mr. Thompson into the ambulance. The old man was safe inside, breathing better thanks to Jake's quick work. Jake climbed into the driver's seat, ready to zoom off to the hospital. His hands were on the wheel, and the engine was rumbling. He was tired but happy he'd saved a life, and that's all that mattered to him. But just as he was about to press the gas, something happened. 2 police cars rolled up, their lights flashing red and blue. The sirens weren't on, but the cars stopped right near the ambulance. 2 officers stepped out. One was tall with a serious face, and the other was shorter with a frown. They didn't look happy. Their boots hit the ground with a thump-thump, and they walked straight toward Linda. The tall officer scratched his head and said, "Ma'am, you called about an ambulance." His voice sounded like he couldn't believe what he was saying. Linda stood up straight, puffing out her chest like a proud peacock. "Yes," she said, nodding fast. "It's in my spot, and I want it gone." She pointed at the big red ambulance with a big smile, like she'd caught a thief. Her voice was loud, and her eyes were shining. She thought the police would jump to help her right away. After all, she'd called 911, and she was sure they'd take her side. That parking spot was hers, or so she thought, and nobody was allowed to touch it. The tall officer raised one eyebrow. He looked at Linda, then at the ambulance, then back at Linda. "You do know this is an active emergency, right?" he said, slow and clear. His words hung in the air like a big question. Linda's smile didn't move, but her eyes blinked fast. "What?" she said, like she didn't hear him right. The shorter officer crossed his arms and stared at her. "That ambulance is here to save someone," he said. "You called us about that." They weren't yelling, but you could tell they weren't happy. That's when Jake opened the ambulance door and stepped out. He'd heard the police talking, and he knew he had to say something. Sweat was dripping down his forehead from all the hard work he'd done. He wiped it off with his sleeve and walked over, his blue uniform a little messy but still proud. He looked at Linda with calm eyes and said, "Lady, I just saved a man's life." His voice was steady, not loud or mean, just true. The neighbors watching from their windows went quiet. They could feel something big was coming. Linda stared at Jake, her arms still crossed. "I don't care," she snapped. "That's my spot." She pointed at the ambulance again, like it was a bad dog she wanted gone. But Jake wasn't done. He took a deep breath and said, "And guess what? That spot you're fighting over? It's not even yours." His words hit like a thunderclap. Linda blinked hard. "What?" she shouted, her voice cracking. She couldn't believe it. Her spot. Not hers. No way. Jake turned and pointed to a sign stuck in the ground nearby. It was small, but the words were big and clear, "Emergency vehicles only." The black letters stood out against the white background, and everyone could read it. The crowd watching gasped all at once, like they'd seen a magic trick. Little Mia's mouth dropped open. "No way," she whispered to her mom. Mr. Jenkins smacked his cane on the ground and laughed. "Ha! I knew it," he said. Mrs. Carter clapped her hands and cheered. The whole neighborhood was buzzing now. Linda's jaw fell so low it almost hit the sidewalk. She stared at the sign, her eyes wide like saucers. "No, no, that can't be right," she stammered. She shook her head fast, like she could make the sign disappear. That spot had her name on it, or at least, she thought it did. She'd told everyone it was hers. She'd even yelled at people who parked too close. But there it was, plain as day, emergency vehicles only. It wasn't her spot. It never was. Her perfect little world was falling apart, and everyone was watching. Jake stood there, calm as ever. "I needed that spot to save Mr. Thompson," he said. "He's in the back right now, alive because I got here fast." He didn't smile or brag, he just told the truth. The tall officer nodded at Jake, like he was saying, "Good job." The shorter officer turned to Linda. "You called us for nothing, ma'am," he said. "This is an emergency zone. That ambulance belongs there." Linda's face went from red to white. She didn't know what to say. The neighbors couldn't stop talking now. She thought it was hers. Mrs. Carter said, giggling. "What a fool." Mr. Jenkins added. Little Mia tugged her mom's sleeve. "Does this mean Linda's in trouble?" she asked. Her mom smiled. "Maybe, sweetie. She messed up big." Everyone could see it now. Linda had been wrong the whole time. Her big fight was over nothing, and Jake had just turned it all upside down with one little sign. Linda's hands dropped to her sides. She looked around, seeing all the eyes on her. The smirk was gone. Her shoulders slumped, and she looked smaller than ever. She'd been so sure she was right. She'd yelled, called the cops, and made a big scene all for a spot that wasn't even hers. Now the police were here, Jake was standing tall, and the neighbors were whispering. Her perfect control was slipping away, and she couldn't stop it. Jake didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He'd said the truth, and the sign backed him up. He gave the officers a quick nod and walked back to the ambulance. He had to get Mr. Thompson to the hospital. His job wasn't done yet. The tall officer tipped his hat to Jake. "Go save that man," he said. The shorter officer looked at Linda and shook his head. "You're lucky we're busy, or this could have been a ticket," he warned. Linda gulped hard. The crowd kept buzzing. "She called 911 on an ambulance," someone said. "And it wasn't even her spot," another added. Laughter mixed with the whispers now. Linda's big moment had turned into a big mess. She'd thought she'd win, but instead, she'd lost big time. Jake climbed back into the ambulance, ready to drive off. He didn't look mad or proud, he just looked like Jake, the guy who saved lives. Linda stood frozen, staring at that sign. "Emergency vehicles only." The words burned into her brain. Her perfect little world wasn't so perfect anymore. Everyone was watching, and for once, she didn't have anything to say. The police started walking back to their cars, shaking their heads. Jake started the ambulance engine. Vroom. It was loud and strong, just like the truth he'd dropped on Linda. What do you think Linda felt right then? Her big plan had crashed, and Jake had shown everyone she was wrong. This was the moment everything flipped. The neighborhood wouldn't forget this, and neither would Linda. Stick around, because this story's not over yet. The police officers stood there, looking at Linda with serious faces. The tall one, with his arms crossed, spoke first. "Ma'am, you're wasting our time," he said. His voice was firm, like a teacher telling a kid to stop fooling around. "False 911 calls are a crime." Linda's eyes got big, and she opened her mouth to argue. But, my spot," she stammered, her voice shaky. She pointed at the ambulance again, like it would help her case. But the shorter officer shook his head slow, like he was tired of her excuses. "You're lucky we're just giving you a warning," he said. "Next time, it won't be so easy." Linda's face went pale. She didn't know what to say. The police didn't yell, but they didn't need to. Their words hit her hard. She'd called 911, thinking she'd win, but now she looked silly. The neighbors watching from their windows started to cheer. "Yeah," shouted Mrs. Carter, clapping her hands. "Finally," said Mr. Jenkins, banging his cane on his porch. Little Mia jumped up and down, hugging her teddy bear. "She's not the boss anymore," she squealed. Everyone was happy to see Linda lose this time. Linda didn't look at anyone. Her shoulders slumped, and she turned toward her house. She walked slow, like a kid who'd been caught doing something bad. Her shoes didn't click loud anymore, they just dragged a little on the sidewalk. She'd been so sure she was right, but now she was defeated. The big red ambulance was still parked in her spot, and the sign said emergency vehicles only. She couldn't fight that. She slunk back inside her house and shut the door quiet. For once, Linda Harper wasn't yelling. Jake didn't stick around to watch. He had more important things to do. He climbed back into the ambulance, his blue uniform still sweaty from saving Mr. Thompson. He didn't say much, just gave the officers a quick nod, like a thank you. Then he shut the door, started the engine, and drove off. Vroom. The ambulance roared down the street, lights flashing again. Jake was on his way to the hospital, a quiet hero who didn't need to brag. He'd done his job, and that was enough for him. The police got back in their cars and left too. The tall one waved at the neighbors as they pulled away. "Stay safe, folks," he called. The street got quiet again, but it didn't feel the same. Something big had changed in Maple Grove. The neighbors didn't go back inside right away. They stood on their porches or peeked out their windows, talking about what just happened. Linda really thought she'd win. Mrs. Carter said, laughing. "She picked the wrong fight," Mr. Jenkins added with a grin. Word spread fast, like a wildfire jumping from house to house. By dinner time, everyone in Maple Grove knew the story. "Did you hear? Linda called the cops on an ambulance," one neighbor told another. "And it wasn't even her spot," someone else said. "Kids talked about it while eating supper. Jake's so cool," Mia told her mom, her eyes wide. "He saved Mr. Thompson and beat Linda." Her mom smiled. "He sure did, sweetie." Even the dogs seemed to bark about it, wagging their tails like they understood. The next big thing happened a few days later at the HOA meeting. Every month, the neighbors got together in the community room to talk about rules and stuff. Linda always sat in the front, holding her clipboard, telling everyone what to do. She'd boss people around, "Fix your fence, move your trash cans," and they'd just nod to keep her quiet. But this time, it was different. When Linda walked in, people didn't look scared or annoyed. They looked at her and whispered, then smiled. She tried to start the meeting like always. "Okay, everyone, let's talk about the new rules," she said, holding up her clipboard. But nobody listened. Mrs. Carter stood up. "Linda, we're tired of your yelling," she said loud. Mr. Jenkins nodded. "You're not in charge anymore," he added, tapping his cane. Even little Mia's mom spoke up. "You can't boss us around after what you did." Linda's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her power was gone, just like that. People started talking over her. "Let's make new rules," someone said. "No more parking fights," another shouted. Linda sat down, her clipboard falling to her lap. She didn't argue. She didn't yell. She just sat there, quiet for the first time ever. The neighbors took over the meeting, and they didn't need her anymore. She'd messed with the wrong guy and the wrong parking spot, and now everyone knew it. Her days as the queen of Maple Grove were over. Meanwhile, Jake kept doing what he did best. The next day, he was back at work, driving his ambulance around town. He didn't talk about Linda or the big fight. He didn't need to. People saw him driving by and waved. "There's Jake," kids shouted, running to the sidewalk. "He's the best," grown UPS said, smiling. At the hospital, Mr. Thompson got better, thanks to Jake. The old man even sent him a thank you note with shaky handwriting. "You're my hero," it said. Jake just smiled and tucked it in his pocket. Maple Grove wasn't the same after that Tuesday. Linda stayed in her house more, not walking around with her clipboard as much. She didn't yell at people anymore, at least, not loud enough for anyone to hear. The neighbors felt freer. They parked where they wanted, left their trash cans out a little longer, and didn't worry about Linda's rules. It was like a big weight lifted off the whole neighborhood. Jake didn't change. He kept saving lives, one call at a time. If he drove by Linda's house, he didn't stop or look. He just kept going, siren blaring when he needed it. People started calling him the real MVP of Maple Grove. MVP means most valuable player, like the star of a team. And Jake was that. He didn't need a crown or a clipboard. He had his ambulance and his kind heart, and that was more than enough. Linda learned a hard lesson that day. She'd thought she could control everything, but she couldn't. Messing with Jake and that parking spot showed her she wasn't the boss she thought she was. The neighbors cheered for justice, and they got it. Linda's warning from the police was a slap on the wrist, but losing her power was the real punishment. She'd never forget it, and neither would anyone else. So, what do you think? Linda's big bossy days were done, and Jake kept being a hero. The neighborhood was happier without her rules. Justice was served, and it felt good. Jake didn't need to say much, he just did his job and let the truth win. That's how it ended, with Linda quiet and Jake shining. What a day in Maple Grove. Okay, let's take a step back and think about what happened in Maple Grove. This whole crazy story with Linda and Jake teaches us something big. Here's the thing, sometimes the loudest people think they're in charge. They yell, they boss everyone around, and they act like the world belongs to them. Linda was like that. She walked around with her clipboard, telling people what to do, thinking she was the queen of everything. She was loud, and she was sure she was right. But guess what? Being loud doesn't mean you're the strongest or the smartest. Then there's Jake. He was quiet. He didn't shout or fight or try to be the boss. He just did his job saving lives with his big red ambulance. He didn't need to tell everyone how great he was. He didn't need a sign with his name on it or a special parking spot. He just helped people, like Mr. Thompson, and kept going. Jake was the real hero, not because he was loud, but because he was good. Sometimes the quiet ones, the ones who don't brag, are the ones who make the biggest difference. That's what this story shows us. Linda learned that the hard way. She thought she could win by yelling and calling the cops. She thought her parking spot was the most important thing in the world. But she was wrong. When Jake pointed to that sign emergency vehicles only, her whole plan fell apart. She looked silly, and everyone saw it. She lost her power, not because someone took it, but because she messed up all by herself. Being loud didn't help her. It just made her mistake bigger. Linda's lesson was tough, but it's one we can all think about. So, let's imagine for a second. What would you have done if you were in Jake's shoes? Picture it, you're driving an ambulance, lights flashing, siren blaring, rushing to save someone. You park in a spot, and someone like Linda starts yelling at you. Would you argue back? Would you try to explain? Or would you just keep going, like Jake did, and let the truth come out later? It's a fun thing to think about. Jake didn't waste time fighting, he focused on helping Mr. Thompson. Maybe that's what makes a hero, knowing what really matters and sticking to it, even when someone's shouting in your face. I'd love to hear what you think. Drop your ideas in the comments below. Tell me what you'd do if you were Jake. Would you stay calm like him, or would you say something to Linda? Maybe you've met someone like her in real life, someone who's loud and bossy. How did you handle it? Stories like this are even better when we share our own thoughts. So go ahead, write it down, and let's talk about it. This story got wild, didn't it? It started with a normal day, then boom, Linda's yelling, Jake saving lives, and the police show up. If it got your heart racing, that's awesome. Give it a big thumbs up if you liked it. That tells me you want more stories like this, crazy, fun, and full of surprises. I've got plenty more to tell, so stick around. Hit that subscribe button too, so you don't miss the next one. There's always something exciting coming up. Here's something cool to think about: in this world, the best surprises come when you least expect them. Linda didn't expect Jake to turn her day upside down. The neighbors didn't expect her to lose her power. And Jake? He didn't expect to be the hero of Maple Grove. Life is like that sometimes. You're going along, doing your thing, and then wham, something amazing happens. It's the quiet moments, the ones you don't see coming, that can change everything. Think about your own life. Have you ever seen a quiet person do something big? Maybe a friend who doesn't talk much but helps you when you're sad. Or a teacher who's calm but teaches you something awesome. Those people are like Jake. They don't need to be loud to be strong. And the loud ones, like Linda? Sometimes they're just making noise, and it doesn't mean as much as they think. That's a lesson we can carry with us every day. This story isn't just about a parking spot or an ambulance. It's about who we are and how we act. Linda thought being loud made her important, but it didn't. Jake showed that being kind and brave is what really counts. We can all be a little like Jake, helping people, staying calm, and doing what's right, even when it's hard. You don't need a siren or a uniform to do that. You just need a good heart. So, what's the big takeaway? Don't judge people by how loud they are. The quiet ones might surprise you. Linda judged Jake and thought he was just some guy in her way. She was wrong, and it cost her. Next time you see someone quiet, think about Jake. They might be the real MVP, just waiting for their moment. And if you're ever in a tough spot, remember you don't have to shout to win, you just have to keep going, like Jake did. Let's keep this going. If you loved this story, tell me why in the comments. Did you cheer when Linda lost? Did you smile when Jake saved the day? Maybe you just liked the part with the sign. Whatever it was, I want to hear it. And if you're excited for more, give that thumbs up and stick with me. There's so much more to come, more heroes, more surprises, more fun. The world's full of stories, and I can't wait to share them with you. In the end, Maple Grove went back to being quiet, but a better kind of quiet. Linda learned to hush up, Jake kept being a hero, and the neighbors felt free. It's a happy ending that makes you feel good inside. Life's like that too. The best things don't always come with a lot of noise. They sneak up on you, like a sunny day after a storm. So keep your eyes open, because you never know when the next big surprise will hit. It might just be the best thing yet.